Okay, everyone. Today, we once again, unfortunately, have something different in store for you. This video will be a follow-up to my last video, as somehow, even with clear evidence of harassment, the drama has not ended. So if this video isn't for you, feel free not to watch it. Believe me, I wish I didn't have to make it. However, if you do watch it, understand that it is research dense, but I recommend you stay to the end to get the full picture. And also, so I don't have to keep making videos like these. First, I'm going to give you a quick TLDR on the situation overall. Second, I'm going to respond to a questionable critique by Serpentext, the text of the serpent. Thirdly, I'm going to give some closing thoughts and also call out some people. I very much intend for this to be the last video I make on this subject, so buckle up.
Part 1. Too long, didn't read. In the previous episode, Faraz is asked a question, which Faraz answers, but then he gets told that he's wrong. Faraz thinks, fair enough, because Faraz has come to his own conclusion after thorough and lengthy amounts of research. Faraz has apparently come to the wrong conclusions and is branded a transphobe, misogynist, homophobe, and racist, amongst other things. Faraz offers discussion and potential resolutions. The offer is rejected, or the offer is avoided, or the offer is ridiculed. Then, Faraz's viewers, subs, mods, finances, social credibility, and character are attacked. Anyone who associates with Faraz is shamed and faces consequence. Faraz ignores this, hoping for it to eventually fizzle out. But the harassment continues for over half a year. Faraz, finally at his wit's end, makes a video, in response to which many individuals come out, saying Faraz is a good guy and they had no idea that this was going on. Faraz is thankful to those individuals because that meant more to him than they could ever imagine. But the people on Twitter harassing Faraz get very upset and engage in the exact behavior depicted in his video, refusing to discuss things with Faraz, refusing to leave Faraz alone, all while shaming anyone standing up for Faraz. All of that brings us to this present moment.
In the last video I made a point to focus on the behaviors of the individuals in question. Rather than focusing on my alleged controversial perspectives or whether they were right or wrong, I wanted to point out the behaviors. I did this because while I see my perspectives to be quite reasonable, I believe that under any circumstance, regardless of perspective, repeatedly targeting and harassing a person over the period of a year is completely unacceptable, especially when the individual has offered many chances for discussion and peaceful resolution. Let's also not forget that despite the constant vitriolic hatred thrown my way, I've always addressed the people in question with a certain level of respect, a courtesy that was clearly not reciprocated. Many people seem to ignore the point I was trying to make completely, instead looking the other way and justifying the actions of Serpentext and crew by saying it's okay, Faraz is a horrible person. Basically hey, are you punching that person? Yeah, but it's okay, he's a transphobe. A transphobe? Oh my. Do you have any proof? Yeah, he said Dave Chappelle had a good comedy special and retweeted someone I don't like. You know what? Doesn't matter. Good job. So let me ask you, and you can comment down below with your answers. Be honest, regardless of perspective, do you think it's acceptable to refuse discussion and instead harass someone for months on end? Do you think it's acceptable to target their friends and acquaintances? Also, food for thought. What is the end game of these attacks? Harming my finances, my livelihood, my friends. What does this achieve other than destruction on my end? What's the end goal? Okay, part 2. First, here's a critique by Serpentext about my controversial viewpoints. A small blog post I included in the last video as a side note and a reference. I've linked the critique down below. Feel free to read it before or after finishing this video. I will be assessing it regardless. It's also important to note, Serpentext and I had a discussion right after she published her blog post. It went quite well in my opinion. However, I do not believe there was any mention of this. Now the research. The next section is going to be dense. I did countless hours of research in efforts to put this to rest. That being said, please stick with me until the end of the video, as there are important points throughout, and especially at the end. Okay, first position I want to address. I am against gender-affirming therapy and the widespread experimentation on children. I am for the ability for gender dysphoric kids to have access to puberty blockers, although only through very stringent and scrutinized processes. Serpentext's response. This is a pure malicious lie to construct fear for how youth are treated. Gender-affirming therapy is a scientifically proven way to best help provide for transgender people and is not given on a whim. My response. Let's deal with the puberty blockers as an experimental treatment first. As part of an evidence review commissioned by the NHS in England, Kachadorian concludes, puberty blockers, in collaboration with transgender competent mental health professionals is an intervention that appears to be appropriate in carefully selected youth with gender dysphoria. Long-term follow-up studies are needed to determine the safety of these treatments in this age group. In The Lancet, a journal that ranks second amongst 169 general and internal medicine journals, a correspondence piece by O'Malley and colleagues states, "There's growing acknowledgement worldwide that the practices of providing gender-affirming care for youth is far from settled science." Why? Well, Oxford and Newcastle professors Hennigan and Jefferson in the journal BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine conclude, "There are significant problems with how the evidence for gender-affirming cross-sex hormone has been collected and analyzed that prevents definitive conclusions to be drawn. Similar to puberty blockers, the evidence is limited by small sample size, retrospective methods, and loss of considerable numbers of patients in the follow-up period. And the current evidence base does not support informed decision-making and safe practice in children." Despite this, places like the Mayo Clinic and gender-affirming practices claim use of GnRH analogs, aka puberty blockers, doesn't cause permanent changes in an adolescent's body. Instead, it pauses puberty, providing time to determine if a child's gender identity is long-lasting. If an adolescent child stops taking puberty blockers, puberty will start or resume. Here's something that people don't tell you. Let's talk about Dr. Marcy Bowers. Dr. Bowers is an American gynecologist and surgeon who specializes in gender-confirming surgeries. Bowers is viewed as an innovator in gender confirmation surgery and is the first transgender woman to perform such surgeries. She is regarded as a top trans doctor. As of July 14th, 2020, Dr. Marcy Bowers became the first person in history to have delivered 2,000 babies and performed 2,000 vaginoplasties for transgender women. Bowers, in an interview with Abigail Schreier, states, "The problem for kids whose puberty has been blocked early isn't just a lack of tissue, but of sexual development. Puberty not only stimulates growth of sex organs, it also endows them with erotic potential. If you've never had an orgasm pre-surgery and then your puberty is blocked, it's very difficult to achieve that afterwards," Bowers said. "I consider that a big problem. Actually, it's kind of an overlooked problem that in our informed consent of children undergoing puberty blockers, we've in some respects overlooked that a little bit. To me, that seems very different from puberty blockers are completely reversible and safe. With all this, puberty blockers have shown to be beneficial to transgender youth, which is why, in my perspectives, I stated that I believe they should be accessible, but only through very stringent and scrutinized means." Next point, Serpentix references detransitioners. Detransition is the act of stopping or reversing gender transition. Serpentix alleges that detransitioners detransition mostly due to social pressure. So let's talk about Kira Bell. Kira Bell from her blog says, "By the time I was 14, I was severely depressed and had given up. Something else was happening. I became attracted to girls. As I look back, I see how everything led me to conclude it would be best if I stopped becoming a woman. My thinking was that if I took hormones, I'd grow taller and wouldn't look much different from biological men. I began seeing a psychologist through the National Health Service, or NHS, when I was 15 because I kept insisting that I wanted to be a boy. I was referred to the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, at the Tavistock and Portman Clinic in London. There I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is psychological distress because of a mismatch between your biological sex and your perceived gender identity. After a series of superficial conversations with social workers, I was put on puberty blockers at age 16. A year later, I was receiving testosterone shots. When 20, I had a double mastectomy. But the further my transition went, the more I realized that I wasn't a man and never would be. As I matured, I recognized that gender dysphoria was a symptom of my overall misery, not its cause. The consequences of what happened to me have been profound. Possible infertility, loss of my breasts, and inability to breastfeed. Atrophied genitals, a permanently changed voice, facial hair. When I was seen at the Tavistock Clinic, I had so many issues that it was comforting to think I really only had one that needed solving. I was a male in a female body, but it was a job of the professionals to consider all my comorbidities, not just to affirm my naive hope that everything could be solved with hormones and surgery. Last year, I became a claimant against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust in a judicial review case. In their ruling, the judges repeatedly expressed surprise at what had been going on at the Tavistock, particularly its failure to gather basic data on its patients. They noted the lack of evidence for putting children as young as 10 years old on drugs to block puberty, a treatment that almost universally is followed by cross-sex hormones, which must be taken for life to maintain the transition. They also had concerns about lack of follow-up data, given the experimental nature of the treatment and the profound impact it has. Then there was the fact that no one really knew the long-term effects of the treatment. For instance, the puberty blockers and testosterone caused me to have to deal with vaginal atrophy, a thinning and fragility of the vaginal walls that normally occurs after menopause. I started feeling really, really bad about myself again. Kirabel is currently in a large-scale legal battle against GIDS Tavistock Clinic. She won the first case. The decision was recently appealed. Bell commented that she planned to seek leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. Regardless, something tells me that Kirabel did not detransition due to social pressure. Next point. Serpentx makes the claim gender-affirming therapy is not given on a whim. Well, here's a detransitioner you can find saying quite the opposite.
I set an appointment with Planned Parenthood, which I know a lot of people do to get hormones because it's easy, which I also think it's a problem that it's too easy.
If you want to know more about detransitioners, you can go to reddit.com/detrans, which I've linked below. I would say the above is enough to warrant caution around gender-affirming therapy. But to be thorough, let's look at two sources Serpentx has quoted throughout the blog. First, she quotes gendergp.com and says, on average, 97% of people who are transgender are happy with their decision to transition. Only approximately 3% of trans people experience some form of regret, but may not detransition. Fair enough. But note that gendergp.com is a gender-affirming clinic, and in their FAQ section, they claim medication to stop puberty is completely reversible. Please see our Mythbuster section for more information. To me, it seems like there may be a conflict of interest with data presented by a gender-affirming clinic about puberty blockers, which are a part of their gender-affirming treatment. But who knows? Maybe they haven't read all the studies. Next, Serpentx quotes a survey from the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS. If you remember, GIDS Tavistock is the gender clinic referred to earlier when we were talking about Kirabel. Here's some more information about GIDS to give the quote some context. The Care Quality Commission inspected the Gender Identities Development Service, GIDS, at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust in October. The NHS's Child Gender Identity Service has been rated inadequate after inspectors identified significant concerns. The BBC also noted insufficient records. In an audit of 10 records of young people referred for hormone blockers in March 2020, only 3 contained a completed consent form and checklist for referral. After an internal review by Dr. David Bell was leaked, several staff at GIDS resigned. Marcus Evans, one of the governors of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, has resigned after accusing its management of having an overvalued belief in the expertise of Gender Identity Development Services, GIDS, which is used to dismiss, challenge, and examination. And later, in the article by The Guardian, Dr. David Bell warned that the GIDS service, as it now functions, is not fit for purpose and children's ends are being met in a woeful, inadequate manner, and some will live on with the damaging consequences. Don't worry, there's more. Sonia Appleby, 62, was awarded £20,000 after an employment tribunal ruled the NHS's Tavistock and Portman Trust's treatment of her damaged her professional reputation and prevented her from proper work on safeguarding. Appleby, an experienced psychoanalytical psychotherapist, was responsible for protecting children at risk from maltreatment. And lastly, and perhaps most informative, The Times has spoken to 5 clinicians who resigned from the service because of concerns over the treatment of vulnerable children who come to the clinic presenting as transgender. They believe that some gay children struggling with their sexuality are being wrongly diagnosed as transgender by the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS clinic. From the interviews, transgender lobby groups are encouraging vulnerable young people and their families to push for medical intervention, regardless of whether specialists agree it is the best course of action. They felt families were systematically demanding to be referred for life-changing hormone treatment on the advice of campaigners. The experimental treatment is being done not only on children, but very vulnerable children who have experienced mental health difficulties, abuse, family trauma. But sometimes those other factors just get whitewashed, one female clinician said. If someone was suggesting plastic surgery or any other permanent change, we'd be saying, hang on a minute. Shortly after this, Dr. Christy Entwistle, a former GIDS clinician, wrote an open letter to Dr. Polly Carmichael, the GIDS director. The following is from said letter. I think it is a problem that GIDS clinicians are making decisions that will have a major impact on children and young people's bodies and on their lives, potentially the rest of their lives. Without a robust evidence base, GIDS clinicians tell children and families that puberty blockers/hormone blocks are fully reversible. But the reality is, no one knows what the impacts are on children's brains. So how is it possible to make this claim? It is also a problem that GIDS clinicians are afraid of raising their concerns for fear of being labeled transphobic by colleagues. I believe that X, reference to a colleague, calling people transphobic when there are clearly no grounds for this allegation causes clinicians to feel anxious about raising concerns. There are children who have had very traumatic early experiences and early losses. At GIDS, no one directly tells you that you're not allowed to suggest that perhaps these early experiences might be connected to a child's wish to transition. But if you make the mistake of suggesting this in a team meeting, you run the risk of being called transphobic. One of my biggest ethical dilemmas whilst working at GIDS was that there were parents who brought their children to GIDS anticipating that we would confirm that the child was not transgender. But we are not able to tell parents that actually there is some unspoken rule that means GIDS clinicians do not tell families, your child is not transgender. I feel like it should now be very clear that GIDS might not be the best source of information here. As such, here's some information on transition regret, not from GIDS, from O'Malley and colleagues. We believe that using the outdated statistic that 1% of people who transition will regret their decision is highly irresponsible and lacks the rigor for which the Lancet group of journals is known. The 1% refers primarily to studies of adults who transitioned in an era when medical transition was only taken under strict protocol. We now find ourselves in a markedly different era, characterized by a 1,727% rise in the number of children seeking to transition. In a study by Lisa Lippman in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, reasons for detransitioning were varied and included becoming more comfortable identifying as their natal sex, 60%, coming to the view that their gender dysphoria was caused by something specific such as trauma, abuse, or mental health condition, 38%, homophobia, or difficulty accepting themselves as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, 23%. The majority, 55%, felt they did not receive an adequate evaluation. Only 24% of respondents informed their clinicians they had detransitioned. I think from this, my conclusion would be that transition regret isn't just a product of social pressure, as Serpenttext purports. And the one-sidedness of gender-affirming therapy might have caused more than a few individuals to proceed with transgender treatments ill-advised. Also, for my against position, the indoctrination of children at young ages, which is not scientifically based, is misleading and is potentially damaging. I also want to show you this from the Government of Canada's website. The Gender Unicorn. You can make your own conclusions here. Next up, the blurring of lines between medically responsible questioning and conversion therapy. First, let's talk about desistants. Desisters are people who experience gender dysphoria and ultimately decide not to transition. From the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychology, a 43% desistance group, 28 boys and 5 girls, were no longer gender dysphoric. Conclusion: most children with gender dysphoria will not remain gender dysphoric after puberty. That being said, the limited desistance research is often critiqued by the transactivism side, claiming faulty mythology or terminology. Thus, with desistance, I will not be stating any concrete conclusions of my own. Instead, down below, I will link 2 articles from either side of the discussion each. What I will say is that the number of desisters is definitely not 0, and therefore not something we should dismiss. Now, with context on desistance, let me tell you about Dr. Kenneth Zucker. For decades, the 65-year-old psychologist had led the Child, Youth, and Family Gender Identity Clinic, GIC, in Toronto, one of the most well-known clinics in the world for children and adolescents with gender dysphoria. In addition to being one of the most frequently cited names in the research literature on gender dysphoria and gender identity development, and the editor of the prestigious journal Archives of Sexual Behavior, he took a leading role helping devise diagnostic and treatment guidelines for gender dysphoric and transgender individuals. He headed the group which developed the DSM-5's criteria for its gender dysphoria entry, for example, and also helped write the most recent Standards of Care guidelines for the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, one of the Bibles for clinicians who treat transgender and gender dysphoric patients. CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, had agreed in February of 2015 to commission an external review. According to a source close to Zucker, he was met at CAMH by Christina Bertha, executive director of the hospital's Underserved Populations Program. Not far into the report, Zucker told Bertha that he had noticed a factual error. Bertha responded that the review would be posted on the hospital's website that afternoon as is, no changes. Zucker continued reading and saw that the reviewers had interviewed a handful of activists and clinicians who had claimed that the GIC was engaging in conversion therapy, that photos were taken of patients without their consent and then disseminated, and that former clients said that they felt traumatized and ashamed as a result of their time there. Then Zucker got a truly bizarre allegation. A former patient at the time of adolescent transitioning from female to male who was seeking a sex reassignment surgery referral said that Zucker had asked him to take his shirt off, laughed when he had done so, and then told him, "You're a hairy little vermin." The incident had never happened. In a few hours, Zucker's many detractors would read about how he had cruelly mocked the body of a young trans person. After his removal in December 2015, though more than 500 clinicians and researchers within the field signed an open letter to CAMH's Board of Trustees expressing dismay at Dr. Zucker's dismissal and defending his integrity and his outstanding contribution to the field. Now, I imagine that despite the open letter, when this review is posted, countless people, without a doubt, believe the allegations against him. Does this seem acceptable to you? Following 3 years of legal fees and media silence, Dr. Kenneth J. Zucker has reached a public settlement with Toronto's CAMH for unfair dismissal and libel. The center's $586,000 payout was accompanied by its public apology for, among other things, publishing the false allegation on their website that Dr. Zucker had called a transgender patient a hairy little vermin. Also, a little side note. Dr. Jack Drescher, a psychiatrist with a research focus on gender identity issues, explained, "Children serve as proxies for the competing value systems of adults. Indeed, some parents of the GIC patients feel that as a result of the clinic's closing, their children have been cut off from a place that was, despite rumors to the contrary, a safe, nurturing environment for young people to explore their emerging gender identity." So why did this all happen? Broadly speaking, there are three main approaches for youth with gender dysphoria. 1. A range of treatments from psychotherapy to peer relations, which attempt to resolve root causes. 2. Watchful waiting. 3. Gender affirmation. In recent years, however, activists have been increasing the pressure to make gender-affirming therapy the only treatment. Non-gender affirming approaches may involve questioning to gain insight into a child's gender dysphoria. Zucker said the clinic also used other approaches with young patients, aged 2 to 12 years old, experiencing gender dysphoria, including watchful waiting and a social transition where children change their names and pronouns. Zucker contested the idea that there is a best practice approach to treating kids with gender dysphoria, asserting there is limited data on the research on the topic, specifically on whether the gender dysphoria will persist into adolescence and adulthood. Zucker said that while he tried to encourage children to accept their birth sex, he supports people making the transition to the gender they identify with if they continue to experience gender dysphoria into adolescence. "There wasn't a one-size-fits-all policy," said Zucker. "I've always accepted where parents are at and what's in the best interest of their child." I don't think Dr. Kenneth Zucker deserved in the slightest this situation. I think it's quite reasonable for medical professionals to adopt a watchful waiting approach for young children, especially children as young as 2 years old. I also think it's reasonable for doctors to ask questions to gain insight into a child's gender dysphoria. Yet, these approaches have been called conversion therapy. I think not only is that a mischaracterization, but I think it diminishes the severity of actual conversion therapy. And as I stated in my controversial perspectives, I am against the blurring of lines between medically responsible questioning and conversion therapy. And I believe on the above cases, that's pretty reasonable. But let me be very clear here. I am against conversion therapy and do not advocate for it in trans individuals. On the topic of conversion therapy, Bill S-202. Definition of conversion therapy. In this section, conversion therapy means any practice, treatment, or service designed to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, or to eliminate or reduce sexual attraction or sexual behaviors between persons of the same sex. For greater certainty, this definition does not include a surgical sex change or any related service. What's the problem with this? Well, according to feminist Jennifer Ann, I have linked her Twitter down below, the amendment to the definition of conversion therapy will basically make it so any non-gender affirming approach to treatment of gender dysphoric individuals will be legally considered conversion therapy. From cases like Dr. Kenneth Zucker, this seems like something with a lot of potential problems. Why talk about Bill S-202? Jennifer Ann says here that
this cannot go forward without them releasing or doing a GBA. So if they can't even do a GBA on that, this is all stemming from Bill C-16. Okay. So I just believe that Bill C-16 doesn't have a chance.
What's a GBA? GBA Plus is an analytical process that provides a rigorous method for assessment of systemic inequalities, as well as means to assert how diverse groups of women, men, and gender diverse people may experience policies, programs, and initiatives. A gender-based analysis. On January 15th, 2021, Prime Minister Trudeau stated to each of his cabinet members, "You will apply gender-based analysis plus, GBA plus, in the decisions you make. Whenever possible, you will work to improve the quality and availability of disaggregate data to ensure that policy decisions benefit all communities." Until recently, requests for the GBA have been met with silence since Bill C-16's passing in 2017. In the third reading of the bill, Senator Linda Frum said in response to Trudeau, "Very nice words, but let me ask, how many of my colleagues have studied or even seen the government's GBA on Bill C-16? I know the answer. The answer is none, because the government's GBA is not available to the likes of you or me." In January 2020, 4W writer Anna Slatz submitted an access to information request with the Government of Canada seeking the impact assessment that would have been done on Bill C-16, specifically where the rights of female inmates were concerned. On December 16th, 2021, Slatz received a response from the government with the document purported to be the GBA. The full contents of the 71-page file are as follows from the feminist website, 4W. Notice 92% of the GBA is redacted. The assessment on the impact of Bill C-16 on women seems to be redacted. What reason do they have for redacting so much of Bill C-16? One theory states that the GBA would reveal a negative effect on women in reference to Bill C-16, and thus the bill would have grounds to be reappealed, which means no Bill S-202. Going back to Senator Linda Frum, we now have Bill C-16, whose legal language protects the extremely vague category of gender expression. By amending the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act to include the words gender expression as protected grounds, as opposed to the word transgender as protected grounds, Bill C-16 redefines what it means to be a woman from something biological to something defined by external appearances. What an astonishing setback for women's rights in Canada. Because of its loose, vague language, it is guaranteed that it will only be a short matter of time before Bill C-16 triggers litigation that will place a financial and legal burden on women who will need to prove that they have a right to women's-only safe spaces and sex-segregated activities, be it prison cells or elder care facilities, abuse shelters, or other residential situations where a woman may desire a female-born woman roommate, be it an athletic or a spa facility where women wish to be protected from the male gaze, or sports teams where women segregate themselves for the purposes of ensuring fair competition. So, did Senator Linda Frum's claim have any validity? From the Global News, Canada's oldest rape crisis center faces backlash over excluding trans women. From CNN, woman loses gym membership after complaining about transgender women in locker room. The Toronto Sun, trans swimmer sparks backlash for breaking U.S. college women's records. From Sportskeeda, when transgender fighter Fallon Fox broke her opponent's skull in MMA fight. From The Guardian, transgender female who sexually assaulted inmates jailed for life. From The Daily Wire, California gives female inmates condoms. Plan B after state forces them to stay with transgenders. When I made the against point, the encroachment on women's rights, especially in sports and incarceration, I think that these provide a basis that this is happening. However, I also believe that my point has been mischaracterized by Serpentext. By saying that women's rights are encroached on, I am not denying in any capacity that in these areas, trans individuals experience terrible things. Transgender prisoner say they never feel safe. Transgender incarcerated in crisis. Nor do I believe that these things should be accepted, but I can also simultaneously acknowledge both groups' experience. Only from there can we find a solution that minimizes the negative effects on both parties. To make it simpler, I can very much be for trans rights and protection from victimization while also acknowledging legitimate problems that women are facing. Next point, back to Bill C-16. Serpentext claims about Bill C-16 in reference to compelled speech. This is in no way different from being disallowed to actively and repeatedly referring derogatory to colored people with racial slurs, women with sexism, gay parents with homophobia, etc. That is not being forced to use certain words. Let's make this clear. I don't mind at all referring to trans people by their preferred pronouns. I don't do it because I'm forced to. I do it because it's not a big deal to me and I don't mind. That's not the problem here. Okay, compelled speech. From a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1943, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Translation: no authority is able to dictate another person's opinions or the words they speak. Someone might say, well, Faraz, you have the freedom of expression, but there are things you cannot say. You are correct. There's a very big difference between you cannot say this and you must say this. One is a consequence for saying a word or phrase considered hateful, regardless of if you believe it or not. The other is consequence for not saying a word or phrase, regardless of if you believe it or not. This is a pretty big distinction. To be required by governmental force to say something you do not necessarily believe is authoritarian policy. For an in-depth look into compelled speech and Canadian law, I've linked a video by Jared Brown, a Toronto lawyer well-versed on the subject. I've also linked more court cases below. An interesting side note, lawyer Jared Brown and company proposed an amendment to Bill C-16, removing only the compelled speech portion. Here's how that went.
Being pragmatic people, those of us who testified that C-16 was an unprecedented compelling of speech, proposed an amendment to the bill. If the supporters of C-16 were serious in their assertion that the legislation would not compel speech, then let's just make that clear on the face of the bill. So we proposed an amendment. For greater certainty, nothing in this act requires the use of a particular word or expression that corresponds to the gender identity or expression of any person. Remember, the Minister of Justice says, we're not here to compel speech. Well, the amendment was unanimously rejected by the Liberal senators.
Another argument commonly made is you can't go to jail for not using someone's pronouns. Well, due to a publication ban, information on this case is not completely available. So I will link the article and you can make your own conclusions. The New York Post, quoting the Post-Millennial, says, the man was found in contempt of court and arrested Tuesday for calling the teen his daughter and publicly referring to them with the pronouns she and her. Next, 3 birds with 1 stone. The degradation and politicization of scientific journals, research, and institutions. The inability to have conversations about these topics without being a terrible risk for all involved, and censorship. Let's talk about Alice Dreger. Alice Dreger is a historian of medicine and science, a sex researcher, and the author of Galileo's Middle Finger. Dreger herself spent about a decade of her early career advocating for intersex people. She is now considered transphobic by the activists. From the left-leaning media source, The Cut. At its core, Galileo's Middle Finger is about what happens when science and dogma collide. Specifically, what happens when science makes a claim that doesn't fit into an activist community's accepted worldview. What she found over and over was that researchers whose conclusions didn't line up with politically correct orthodoxies, whether the orthodoxies in question involved sexual abuse, transgender issues, or whatever else, often faced dire, career-threatening consequences simply for doing their jobs. First example, Napoleon Chagnon, an extremely influential anthropologist who dedicated years of his life to understanding and living among the Yanomamo. A journalist named Patrick Tierney published Darkness in El Dorado, How Scientists and Journalists Devastated the Amazon. The book and a related New Yorker article by Tierney leveled a series of spectacular allegations against Chagnon and James V. Neal, Sr. Among other things, Tierney charged that Chagnon and Neal had intentionally used a faulty vaccine to infect the Yanomamo with measles so as to test Nazi-esque eugenics theories, and that one or both men had manipulated data, started wars on purpose, paid tribespeople to kill one another, and purposely withheld medical care while experimental subjects died from the allegedly vaccine-induced measles. Scientists killed Amazon Indians to test race theory, read a Guardian headline. And he was forced to defend himself against accusations that he had brutalized members of a tribe he had devoted his career to living with and studying. A number of fellow anthropologists and professional organizations came to the defense of Chagnon. These voices were drowned out by the hysteria over the evil, murderous anthropologist and his doctor accomplice. Like Ken Zucker's story, these stories so far seem to have a common theme. There was, as it turns out, nothing to these claims. Dreger discovered the disturbing, outrageous degree to which the charges against Chagnon and Neal were fabricated, to the point where some of the numerous footnotes in Tierney's book plainly didn't support his own claims. All the explosive accusations were simply made up or willfully misinterpreted. Worse, some of them could have been easily debunked with just a tiny bit of research. As of 2015, Darkness in El Dorado is still available on Amazon, its original glowing reviews and mention of its National Book Award nomination intact. And Tierney's New Yorker article is still online with no editor note explaining the factual inaccuracies contained therein. Next example. J. Michael Bailey, a Northwestern University psychologist and researcher of human sexuality and former chair of that university's psychology department. In 2003, Bailey released The Man Who Would Be Queen. From a scientific perspective, he explicitly viewed the idea that everybody is truly and easily assignable to one of two gender identities as an oversimplification. Andrea James, a trans activist, started going after Bailey shortly after the book's publication. She posted photos of Bailey's young daughter online with nasty text underneath, in one case calling her a cock-starved exhibitionist, sent angry emails to his colleagues, and quickly turned on anyone who didn't join in her crusade, including some who said that they felt that their own life stories had been accurately and sympathetically captured in Bailey's book. James herself, Dreger reveals, acknowledged her own autogynephilia using that exact word in a 1998 letter. The allegations were so serious and came in such heaping quantity that Bailey's reputation was permanently tarnished in the eyes of many casual observers. What those observers can't have known was his long-standing history of support for transgender people. He had used his perch as a researcher to advocate passionately for better treatment of this population and for improved access to gender reassignment resources, and had even, at the request of one of his subjects in his book, written letters to physicians on behalf of a group of young trans women who were seeking reassignment surgery. The Man Who Would Be Queen had been nominated for the Lambda Literary Awards 2004 prize. The organization voted to yank the nomination. But to get a flavor of the quality of the evidence amassed against Bailey by his critics, consider one charge: that Bailey had practiced psychology without a license. There's no legal basis to this claim. Or the charge that he had sex with one of his subjects. Dreger explains, after nearly a year of research, I could come only to one conclusion. The whole thing was a sham. Bailey's sworn enemies had used every clever trick in the book, juxtaposing events in misleading ways, ignoring contrary evidence, working the rhetoric, and using anonymity whenever convenient, to make it look as though virtually every trans woman represented in Bailey's book had felt abused by him and had filed a charge. Imagine if Bailey's controversy dropped tomorrow. Imagine how various outlets, all racing to publish the hottest take and all forced to rely on those sparse, ambiguous scraps of evidence that filter down in the first days of uproar over an unfamiliar subject, would cover it. If anything, all the incentives have gotten worse. If anything, the ranks of dedicated, safely employed critical thinkers in a position to be the voice of reason have thinned. In all likelihood, the coverage today would be far uglier and more prejudicial than it was when the scandal actually broke. Science can't function in this sort of pressure cooker environment. It will become hard, if not impossible, for careful researchers unencumbered by dogmatic ideology to make good faith efforts to understand controversial subjects and then to publish their findings. If activists, any activists, regardless of their political orientation or the rightness of their cause, get to decide by fiat what is and isn't acceptable interpretation of the world, then science is pointless. Second last point. Easy one, but requires clarification. The performative behavior surrounding the activism, e.g. pronouns in bio or email footer, or terminology like birthing people. The clarification is that I do not believe all behavior surrounding pronouns or terms like birthing people to be performative. I believe that there definitely are many people that use these terms who aim for compassion. I also believe that there are people who use the terminology to virtue signal with little regard for trans rights in general. That behavior is what I'm against. Lastly, the definition of transphobic to include anything that could potentially be deemed offensive or uncomfortable for trans individuals and activists. I believe that it is very clear by now that this is a very reasonable position. Furthermore, a short-sightedness of the definition Serpentext cited is that negative attitudes and beliefs can include almost anything depending on a person's perspective. Here's a few excerpts from the Gids disaster to be thorough. Evans, a psychoanalyst, subsequently resigned. In my 40 years of experience in psychiatry, I have learned that dismissing serious concerns about a service or approach is often driven by a defensive wish to prevent painful examination of an overvalued system, he complained in his resignation email. This is difficult in the current environment as the debate and discussion required is continually being closed down or effectively described as transphobic or in some way prejudicial. Since leaving Gids, I've continued to follow transgender issues online And one of the things that I have felt concerned about is seeing the bullying and intimidation for those people who raise valid concerns about children making a medical transition being called transphobic and TERFs on forums such as Twitter. Okay, now that the dense research portion is done, closing thoughts and callouts. Part 3. Let's go over a few things Serpentex alleges in her blog post. Firstly, not only does Serpentex blur my positions, she dishonestly treats certain claims as if they are obviously true. Like here. Or here on Abigail Shrier about social contagion. Neither Abigail Shrier nor Lisa Lippman has ever claimed transgenderism is a social contagion. Instead, they have found evidence that social contagion may play a role in the recent explosion of girls and their teens identifying as trans. What Serpentex used is a common tactic to make something completely false seemingly true by changing just a few words. Serpentex also claims I bullied her, and as such, therefore I am transphobic. Let's get this straight. Firstly, Serpentext, I have never bullied you. What bully ignores a person after months of harassment, followed by a statement of, leave me alone? Secondly, any disagreement with you or pushback against you has nothing to do with you being trans. You could be white, black, straight, gay. I don't care. I push back because of the behavior you have exhibited towards me, which, regardless of how you identify, has been quite terrible. I also want to close the book on another tactic Serpentex uses. She says, because Feroz says the same thing as insert person here, for example, Jordan Peterson or Dr. Deborah So, Feroz is wrong and transphobic. Firstly, I am perfectly capable of coming to my own conclusions through my own research. Secondly, good people can have bad ideas and bad people can have good ideas. The notion that someone is allegedly reprehensible, therefore nothing they say is valid, is a ridiculous notion. And for the record, I think Jordan Peterson and Dr. Deborah So are great. And I also think many of their ideas are incredibly well-founded and have no business being dismissed. Even still, my ideas are my own, not flimsy copies of someone else's. Next. Probably my biggest critique. Serpentex seems to view everything from a trans-only lens and seemingly does not acknowledge not everyone who is diagnosed with gender dysphoria is trans. There are many young gender dysphoric children who grow up to be gay rather than trans. There are other gender dysphoric individuals who desist, and there are also detransitioners. So I understand how advocating for trans children getting proper medical care and how gender-affirming care can be helpful. But Serpentex also needs to acknowledge that gender dysphoric children aren't always trans. Many are young gay children. And as seen with detransitioners, a lot of the trans-affirming practices will subject them to life-changing consequences. On the subject, another thing Serpentex seems to purport is that Feroz apparently do not acknowledge trans victimhood. She also seems to purport that the suffering of the trans community is in opposition to the points that I made. So let me be clear. I fully acknowledge that in general, trans individuals are subject to a lot of horrific things. I also am quite aware that there are trans individuals that need better medical care and practices. I definitely acknowledge how difficult it must be to be trans, especially in the face of discrimination. And I am for trans rights and the ability for trans individuals to not be discriminated against on the basis of being trans. That being said, it's important we advocate for trans rights while also acknowledging the data. For example, how else are we going to come to a solution that serves both the trans individuals and the feminists in the situation cited in the encroachment on women's rights topic? I recently interviewed Dr. Deborah So, a PhD in sexual neuroscience research and an author of the book, The End of Gender. She makes the point.
In this case, pretending that the facts I cite don't exist doesn't make them go away. Ignoring the truth doesn't make one's argument stronger. If anything, it will do a disservice to the communities that activists claim to be protecting.
Which I believe to be accurate. By labeling everything that is not in favor of a narrative as transphobic and harassing and harming anyone who disagrees, if anything, you are harming the trans rights movement, not helping. As for the tweets Serpentex references, I see no reason to apologize for retweeting what I have. A retweet can mean as little as, hey, I think this is interesting, and is not necessarily, oh, I 100% agree with everything this person has said and done and advocate for everything they believe in. Other people have alleged that I don't listen to trans people or I need to listen to them more. This one annoys me a bit because it implies I only look at one side of the argument or am under-researched. Not only have I done a massive amount of my own research, but I actively watch any videos sent to me. And yes, that includes videos sent to me by trans people. By the way, Law lied. Still waiting for that document 8 months later. However, while I do agree with many of the things that trans YouTubers say, that doesn't mean I agree with all of them. And just because I don't echo their viewpoints doesn't mean I haven't heard or listened to them. Like this one, which I definitely disagree with.
But also, if the kid doesn't end up being transgender, they're completely reversible. You can just stop taking hormone blockers and your puberty will progress normally. I don't see the risk.
Also on that subject, I want to provide you still watching with a resource from someone whom most definitely disagrees with me. Why? because I am certain a lot of these arguments will be used disingenuously in critique of this video. You may remember from the Alice Dreger and Ken Zucker portions of this video. Andrea Jean James, born in 1967, is an American transgender rights activist, film producer. Also the creator of transgendermap.com, a free website about trans issues. This website has sections on many of the individuals I have referenced in the video, of course labeling them all as transphobic. I've linked each of their dedicated pages down below. You can decide yourself if they really are transphobic, and if the information dictating as such is accurate, or if it's not. Lisa Littman, Abigail Schreier, Ken Zucker, J. Michael Bailey, Deborah So, Alice Dreger, Detransition, Desistance. Careful though, this website also has a section instructing children on how to get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones without parental consent, all while not alerting them to any of the medical risks. Another way is to start hormones from another source and then tell your doctor that you do not want to take them without a doctor. Some doctors may help you to lower the chances of hurting yourself. Do with that what you will. To the people who after this video still accuse me of transphobia, not everyone who disagrees with a narrative is transphobic. For example, you might allege certain individuals cited as transphobic, wrongly in my opinion. But are you also going to call Dr. Marcy Bowers, the trans doctor who has performed over 2,000 trans surgeries, transphobic as well? From a Colette interview with Lisa Littman. It's part of a larger issue surrounding the study of gender dysphoria, where if the research findings or opinions are not consistent with a very specific gender narrative, there are efforts to shut down the discussion. This sounds familiar. It's likely that the initial people accusing me of transphobia don't actually think I'm transphobic, in the worst sense of the word. It's likely that my opinions and research are not consistent with a very specific gender narrative. And from there are dishonest and egregious efforts to shut down the discussion. The unfortunate side effect of trying to silence me is now a lot of people allege that I am transphobic without even knowing what I really believe or why. There will likely be efforts to continue that. Of course, I will always advocate for you to do further research. One of the sources Serpentext used, glad.org, seems to be at least a little better than our other sources. Let's wrap this up. To all the people who haphazardly tweeted or called me transphobic, will you apologize to me for the reputational and financial damages caused unjustly? How about for the stress and duress you have caused to those whom support me? I also want to address a certain tweet that I found to be particularly disingenuous. To Zeus, next time you subtweet and virtue signal by putting words into my mouth and supporting allegations of transphobia, maybe you should do a little research so you understand exactly who and what you are condemning. Of course, I wouldn't be surprised if Zeus pretended this video or my call-out never existed. When confronted with their own shameful behavior, many people will disengage or pretend it never happened. This is generally so that they can propagate the image that they were justified in their harassment, which of course continues to propagate a lie. A tactic a lot of my earlier critics will definitely continue to abuse. To everyone else who continues to harass me, I don't do Twitter battles. One reason being you get interactions like this. At the very least, it seems like he got the last part right. Twitter battles are incredibly ineffective. They are not discussions. For example, do you think I could have gotten any of the points in this video across in a tweet? So either understand that there is more to a person than their political opinions, or agree to a discussion, or leave me alone. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I know this has been long, so I appreciate you sticking with me through this. Trust me, this was a massive amount of work. But at the very least, I hope you come out of this video knowing and understanding more than you did before watching it. And also perhaps better understand some dishonest tactics commonly used to shut down discussions. So let me know in the comments what you think about the video. Hopefully, I never have to make one on this topic like this again. Making this video and the events surrounding it have been incredibly stressful, and I would very much like this to be the end of the false allegations and drama. I want to move on to other things. That being said, thank you everyone who helped me and supported me through this. Without you, I don't know if I would have been able to effectively stand up against this. It is truly, truly appreciated. Until next time, make sure your thoughts and your actions are your own.